Welcome to the Illumination Lectures again. And today we're going to look at megaliths and microliths as well from the Near East. And today we're going to deviate somewhat from the standard format of these lectures because we're going to look into a lecture I did at the beginning of 2020 on the megaliths of the Near East. And this is pertinent to the books that I've been writing because some of these megaliths and microliths underpin the beliefs and religious systems that were being used by some of the main players and characters that we've looked at in these books, including King Jesus Esus of Odessa. So this is the talk Eastern Megaliths and Microliths by myself, Ralph Ellis. And this is going to be a grand tour of the Near East and all of the interesting artifacts that we can find there. And this is taken from my King Jesus trilogy, which is now a trilogy in 4 parts. So it starts with Cleopatra to Christ, which is looking at the ancestry of Jesus and his heritage back in Egypt. And then King Jesus, which looks at real historical events within the gospel stories, proving that this is a real historical account. And then a real blockbuster, this is Jesus, King of Odessa. This is at last finding the biblical Jesus in the historical record. He was a real king. He was as the title suggests, he was a king of Odessa. And then the fourth one in this trilogy, it's now a trilogy in 4 parts, is the Grail Cipher, which is a complete reinterpretation of Arthurian legend, putting it back into its real, true history. And that is a little bit surprising for some people that it's not necessarily connected with the British 6th century. There is a lot of biblical type material in Arthurian legend as well. So back in the Near East, we start with the Temple of Jerusalem. So we're looking at megaliths here, and this is the foundation for the Temple of Jerusalem. And you can see here the standard megaliths that underpin the temple platform at Jerusalem. And perhaps you might recognize these megaliths because they seem to be very similar to these megaliths. And where are we now? We're in Egypt. This is the Temple of Giza, and again this is a huge temple platform upon which certainly the second pyramid is built. And this platform is made of megaliths that look exactly the same as the megaliths back at Jerusalem. So let's head back to Jerusalem again, have a look at these megaliths and compare them with this one here. Yeah, this is Jerusalem, and we see a very similar type of architecture and building design here at Jerusalem. But again, look at this megalith and just have a look at its shape, at the holes in the top of it, which presumably are some sort of devices for lifting it. And now let's compare this megalith with one at Baalbek. So this is the Temple of Baalbek, just up the road in Lebanon. And again, we have this huge temple platform, which is megalithic. And note it's same as at Jerusalem, it's megalithic down the bottom, and we have smaller stones up the top. So the top of this platform is Roman, and the bottom is megalithic. And perhaps we can see this more clearly if we go underneath this platform. So now we're underneath the temple platform in Baalbek. It has 3-4 tunnels that run all the way through the platform. And again, perhaps here you can see there are megaliths down below and then a Roman arch above. Interesting to what's happened here. Why did the Romans take away? Obviously there were megaliths. They would have been megalithic stones on the top of this corridor. in ancient times, and the Romans saw fit to actually take those away and put a Roman arch on the top. Why was that? Had it eroded it away? Was it cracked or something due to earthquakes or something of that nature? We don't exactly know why the Romans went to the trouble of actually putting a different arch structure for the roof on this particular walkway. But you can clearly see the two building eras here. We have a megalithic era underneath and a Roman era up above. But when was the megalithic era? We don't know because it's very difficult to date stone. So we can only guess that it was prior to, obviously, the Roman era. But perhaps we can get a clue from here. We're back at Giza again here. Perhaps we can get a clue from the erosion rates on, this happens to be the Great Pyramid at Giza. And here you can see the pavement that's just underneath the Great Pyramid. And you can see there's a line there. There are some different stones to the left, but the stone on the right has a line down the middle of it. Why does it have a line? Well, because there are two different erosion patterns here. Because, well, if we look at the next image here, what I've done here is I've put the casing blocks back onto the pyramid. So on the right side, there were originally casing blocks, bright white Tura limestone casing blocks. And to the left was the pavement at the bottom of the pyramid. And this was always open to priests, tourists, the weather, and it was eroding over the centuries, over the millennia. But the stone to the right was protected by those casing blocks, indicated by those sloping orange lines. But at some point, and we know this to be about 1,000 years ago, someone came along and stole those casing blocks. And that happened during the Muslim era about 1,000 years ago. And so now we have two different erosion rates on these two sides of this paving block. And remember, this is one paving block. It's not two paving blocks. It's one paving block that has had two different erosion patterns upon it. So on the left is the area that has always been open to the weather and the feet of pilgrims. To the right, we have the area that's only been open to the weather and the pilgrims for about the last 1,000 years. And the interesting thing is the differential. The differential between the left and the right is about 10 times the erosion on the left-hand side. But if we know that the erosion on the right has only been happening for 1,000 years, then the erosion on the left has possibly been happening for 10,000 years. So from these differential erosion patterns, we can get a rough idea for the megalithic era, for when the pyramids were actually built. And it looks from these erosion patterns that the Great Pyramid was built something like 10 to 12,000 years ago. So going back to Baalbek then, this is the small temple at Baalbek. This is often known as the Temple of Aphrodite. And we say it's the small temple, but it is easily as big as the Parthenon in Greece. And to get an idea of scale, it's very difficult in this image to see how large it is, but if you look at the columns from the corner, 1, 2, 3 columns to the left, you'll see a little dark image at the bottom. And that is a person. So you can see how large this particular temple is. It is absolutely huge, but it is almost complete. It would only take a little bit of TLC to put it back into its original condition. And it's really interesting to see the work that was put into these temples. It is absolutely magnificent. This is looking at the lintels between the pillars and the actual temple itself, and you'll see that all of the lintels are intricately worked before they were put into position. And this is one of the capitals to the pillars, and you can see it's not only a marvellous piece of stonework, but it's almost in its original condition. So the temple itself is in very good condition. But that's not the largest temple on the Baalbek site. This is the largest temple. This is the Temple of Jupiter. And this is Roman. I mean, it is megalithic, of course, because it is absolutely huge, but it is Roman. But it is megalithic because these columns are about 2.4 meters diameter and 19 meters high. They are absolutely huge, and they're formed from 3 drums. But each of those drums must be about 70 tons. And the lintels on the top, I couldn't really decide if they were made in one piece or 2 pieces. But if they're in one piece, they're about 200 tons. If they're in 2 pieces, they're about 100 tons each. This was a stupendous piece of architecture for the era. This was built probably around 1900 years ago. And again, we can't get a very good idea of the scale here because there was no one at Baalbek when I was there. So here is a person. Now you can see how large these pillars are. As I say, they're 2.4 meters in diameter. They're absolutely huge. And the temple itself, when it was completed, must have been a really impressive structure. It was indeed the largest temple in the Roman Empire. And it was here at Baalbek in the Lebanon. But if we look at the base, again, these temples are built on temple platforms. If we look at the temple platform, we will find not Roman architecture, but now we're back into the megalithic era. And these are the Baalbek trilithons. And these are the huge stones that underpin the temple platform. And they are absolutely enormous. There's 1, 2, at least 3 on the top, and there's some more down the bottom. Again, you can't get a perspective on how large they are because when I was in Lebanon, obviously it's a relatively dangerous place. I was the only person there at the temple for 2 days. Apart from a party of Koreans, I think they were, who sort of passed through, I was the only person there on the site. So it's very difficult to get any perspective on these stones. So I've taken this image from the internet because it shows a person at the base of this foundation. So here you can see a person, and now you can see that these stones at the bottom are in the realms of 3 meters by 15 meters by 3 meters. They are absolutely huge stones. And you have to wonder why anyone would want to use stones of this size for their building project. I mean, wouldn't it be easier to cut them into smaller pieces and transport them in smaller pieces and then cement them back together again? I mean, we know the Egyptians had very, very good cements. If you look at the casing blocks on the Bent Pyramid down in Dashur, the cement or the plaster they were using is incredibly strong. It's very, very, very high quality plaster. And in places where the stones have moved, it's the stone that's cracked, not the plaster. So they could quite easily have used smaller stones and concreted them together once they were in position. But no, they used these huge, great megaliths. And these are not even the biggest megaliths on this site. This is one of the biggest ones. And this stone is still in the quarry down the road. This is about 2 kilometers down the road, and that's me on the top of the stone of the pregnant woman. There's me standing on the top when I visited Lebanon back in 2008, I think it was. Anyway, a while ago. And it's known as the stone of the pregnant woman because it's still attached to the earth. You can't see it here, but in recent times, this area has been excavated and dug out, and the stone is indeed sitting on a plinth. It's still attached to Mother Earth. So in a way, it can be viewed as like a fetus still attached to Mother Earth via its umbilical. It is the stone of the pregnant woman, with the pregnant woman being Gaia herself, about to release her stone to be taken up to the temple platform. But it was never used. For whatever reason, this stone was never used, and it's still lying there in the quarry. But this is not even the largest stone on this site. This is the largest stone. It's another 3 kilometers down the road in another quarry. And this is the stone of Colossus. And this is even bigger. This is about 4.5 meters by 4.5 meters by 24 meters, I think it is. And it weighs in the realms of 1,200 tons. And there again is me standing on the top of the stone. And I had great fun trying to take this picture because, again, I was the only person there. So the only way I could take this particular picture was by setting my camera up on a tripod and setting the timer, which happened to be a 10-second timer, which is not really enough time. Setting the timer and then running down to the end of the stone and taking up my picture pose. Trouble was, 10 seconds was not quite enough, so I ended up with 14 pictures of me stumbling across the top of the stone and falling over. And finally, on the 15th, I got a picture of me in picture pose at the end of this stone. But again, you've got to wonder why on earth someone would want to make a stone of this size, a brick of this size, for their building project up the road at the Temple of Baalbek. Why would you want to carry a stone weighing 1,200 tons to build a temple platform, when you could cut it up quite easily and move the smaller stones? In fact, at the end, just past myself there, on this particular stone, you'll see someone has used this stone as a quarry. They've actually quarried a smaller stone out of the big stone because it was much easier to take a smaller stone. Why did they use such big stones? It can only have been because it was simple for them. But the way in which using stones of this nature was simple, I will leave up to you to speculate upon. Why was it simple for the designer? Back in the megalithic era, we're talking 10,000 years ago here. Why was it simple for the designer to use this type of huge megalith? So while we're at Baalbek, let's have a look at the temple itself. This is a panoramic of the Temple of Baalbek. This is the sort of antechamber, as it were, and look at the size of this temple. And this is not the temple itself, that's behind us. This is the antechamber before you get to the temple. And look at the size of that temple complex. Look at the amount of, we tend to think we're rich in the modern era, but think of the resources that were used to make a temple of that size during the Roman era. But why was it destroyed? We see it in this dilapidated state. Why was it destroyed? Well, the detail is in the upper portions of the walls. So if we look at this panoramic again, okay, here it comes again. Look at the top of the walls. Now you'll see some battlements, are they, across the top there? And now again, as we come around to the right, see those battlements on the right-hand side? All the way across the top of the wall. So why has this temple been destroyed? It was destroyed by the Romans themselves, the Byzantine Romans. Because they tore down their own temple in order to turn it into a fortress. Remember, this was the Pax Romana, the Roman peace. Most of the towns and cities in the Roman Empire were not protected by city walls because there was peace within Rome for 800 years. Their cities did not need walls. And when they had the Muslim invasions of the 8th century, 7th and 8th centuries into this region, they had no city walls. All they could do was tear down their temples and turn their temples into a fortress. And that is exactly what they've done here at Baalbek. They turned their temple into a castle. And this happened all across this region. This is Spitla, which is over in North Africa. And again, you see that hurriedly made wall attached to the forum. This is the forum. You see 3 temples actually inside the forum, and that's the forum gate. And then this hurriedly made wall that goes around the forum. They tore down their entire city to make the forum into a fortress because of the approaching Muslim armies. And here again, this is the Temple of Didyma. Now we're in western Anatolia. And again, you see that the temple is derelict here. Why? Because you'll see this wall. It goes all the way around the temple complex. You will see a wall. That is the temple itself. They tore down their own temple to make this wall, this protective wall around their temple, to turn their temple into a castle because of the invading Muslim armies. And this is what happened to Syria. These are the dead cities of Aleppo. All around Aleppo, which is in northern Syria, there are supposed to be 800 towns, cities and settlements across northern Syria that are lying derelict to this day because of the Muslim invasions. So as they swept through this region, they depopulated their region entirely. And these cities, well-built cities, are still standing there to this day. You can still walk down their high streets. You can still walk into their churches, like this church here. And they've been empty now for 1,200 years. Here's another of them. Again, another dead city of Aleppo. These great towns and cities completely depopulated after the Muslim invasions. And here's another one. This is a rather magnificent basilica, a big church or cathedral, again abandoned and deserted for more than 1,000 years. And interestingly, amongst all of these cities, we find these pyramid tombs. And these are actual tombs. We know these are tombs, but they're pyramidal. They're just like the ones we find down in Judea. And this is one of the pyramids of Aleppo. And they come in all sizes, small and large. This is a fairly small one for a small, not so important family. Here's a more imposing one, a vast pyramid tomb. An awful lot of expenditure being spent on this one. And the interesting thing is not just that it is associated with Egypt, it has a pyramid on its summit, but also, if you look inside, the sarcophagi are Judeo-Christian. So these are the sarcophagi inside this pyramid, and if you look at the rosettes on the sarcophagi, you can see the Chi-Rho, the symbol of Christianity. But if you look at the lids on these sarcophagus, you can see each one has the 4 horns of the Judaic altar. So we can confidently say that these pyramid tombs are Judeo-Christian. And since they are linked with Egypt and Judaism and Christianity, we can perhaps confidently also say they are Nazarene Galilean, the same sort of sect as the biblical Jesus, as we've discussed in previous lectures and talks. And this is the ancient city of Apamea. And I put this in here just to show how rich and powerful Syria was in this era. This is the era that the King Jesus Isis wanted to control. And it's not the basket case region that we see today when we look at Syria. In its day, in the Roman era, Syria was the richest part of the Roman Empire. And you can see that in the towns and cities that populate this region. And so if King Jesus Isis of Odessa had taken over this region, he would have been in a very powerful position to then take the throne of Rome. So this is the city of Apamea. This is the city of Palmyra. out in the Syrian desert. And this wasn't the biggest temple in the Roman Empire, but it was perhaps the richest temple in the Roman Empire. If you look at the pillars, they are unfinished on the top. The reason for that is the capitals on these pillars were originally made of bronze. And bronze was stupendously expensive in this era. So to make the capitals of these pyramids, of these pillars into of bronze, demonstrated the wealth that they had in Palmyra. And remember, Palmyra only grew from the desert in the 1st century. It was a fairly new city. It was the second city of King Jesus of Odessa. The primary city of their small kingdom was Odessa, and this was their second city out in the Syrian desert. This is interesting because this is out in the Syrian desert as well. This is Rasathi. And I just put it in here because today you'll see people saying, out in Africa or whatever, they're short of water, someone must do something. Someone from the West must do something. We're short of water. Well, if you live in an area that is short of water, an arid region, this is what you build. This is not a cathedral. This is a water system. And for the size of this water system, if you look at the back wall, you'll see a person there with their arms outstretched. That's a person down there. These water systems are absolutely huge. And there were 2 of them side by side, buried underground, of course, for strength. So they're both underground in the city of Rasathi. And these would have been full to the brim of water after the winter rains. And this is what you do in this sort of region if you live in an arid region. You go to some trouble to actually build something like this. And this is interesting as well. This comes from Lebanon, and this is known as the Alexander Sarcophagus. And it's supposed to be the sarcophagus of a Phoenician king. But if you know anything about Phoenicia, you will know that they tended to copy Egyptian symbolism, and their funerary arrangements were normally fairly rude and rudimentary. But here, suddenly, we have the finest piece of Greek sculpture in the ancient world. So, is this of a Phoenician king? Or is this actually the tomb of Alexander the Great himself? Because we don't actually know what happened to the body of Alexander the Great. It left Persepolis on this great wagon train with this enormous great wagon carrying his sarcophagus, this specially made very large wagon containing suspension systems to carry his sarcophagus back to Greece. But it never arrived back in Greece. And we don't know what happened to it. So, did it end up here in Lebanon? Because here in this supposedly Phoenician tomb, we have this sarcophagus that depicts Alexander the Great. You'll see him on the left-hand side here. That is Alexander the Great fighting against Darius III in a very famous scene that was portrayed all across the Roman Empire. And this is the finest piece of Greek sculpture in the Greek world. So is this the sarcophagus of Alexander the Great? I think it's possible. And also in this area, a little bit further north, we come across this, going back into megaliths again. You might be familiar with this. This is the Temple of Göbekli Tepe. And it's interesting because A, it's megalithic, and B, it's possibly the oldest megalithic structure in the world. This is supposed to be something like 12,000 years ago, this particular temple was constructed. And another interesting thing from the viewpoint of my books is that this temple is right next door to Odessa. It's just outside the city of Odessa. So it's intimately connected with this Odessan story about King Jesus being the king of Odessa. And this temple was covered up at some point in its history. it was all completely buried, and so nobody knew where it was. There are several of these circles, in fact, in this complex, and all of them were covered up with earth and stones and debris, so that the whole temple complex disappeared. Now, when did that happen? It's said that that happened way back in the distant past. But, of course, dating something like the covering up of a temple is notoriously difficult. Was this covered up at the end of the Odessan Empire by the Romans? Well, that's something that we're going to look at in further detail in another book. And where is Odessa? Well, here's Odessa. You can see it actually on the end of the arrow here. So for orientation, Mediterranean Sea's on the left. We've got Jerusalem down on the bottom left. Syria is in the sort of pinky colours, going all the way up to Antioch. And then if you go eastwards from Antioch, we go across the Euphrates. That's the blue line there is the river Euphrates. And there is Odessa. So it's just beyond the Euphrates, which is a familiar term if you ever read Josephus Flavius and his Jewish wars. And that's the city of Odessa. And if you go directly south of Odessa, you will come to Palmyra, which is where that great temple of Palmyra is. So that's the region we are talking about. And here is modern Odessa. They call it Sanlur for now. And this is looking from the city up towards the citadel on the top of that hill there. And you can see two pillars there remaining of the ancient citadel. That would have been the palace, the original palace of King Jesus Isis. They built a new palace down in the valley in later centuries. And this is another site just outside Odessa. This is the necropolis of the Odessan kings. This is the Temple of Sogmatar. And the interesting thing about Sogmatar, it's a very ethereal place. It's stuck out in a desert just towards the southeast of Odessa with these strange round towers, which we'll have a look at in a minute. But the odd thing about it is right in the center of Sogmatar is this man-made hill. And I thought this was rather interesting because this man-made hill is exactly the same size as this man-made hill. This is the Temple of Silbury in England. It's just odd that we have two structures that are very, very similar to each other in such different locations, such widely separated locations. And we don't exactly know when these two structures were actually built, whether they're contemporaneous or not. Also at Sogmatar we have these. Now we do know when these were constructed. These are round, truncated round tower tombs. And these were actually used as Nazarene-type Judean tombs. But I think these round towers are rather symbolic of pyramids. If you had been instructed into the secrets of the Great Pyramid, you would know that the Great Pyramid is based upon 2 pi r. That's the design that it was built upon. And 2 pi r is a circle. So you could say that the pyramid is a circle. So if you didn't have the resources to build an enormous Great Pyramid, then perhaps you could build a round tower because you knew that a round tower was symbolic of the Great Pyramid. And then you could build a very similar shaft going downwards to the bottom of the round tower. As you can see here, there is a shaft that goes to the bottom. And at the bottom of the round tower is a burial chamber. And this is interesting as well because it has a rolling stone on the front, of biblical fame. So on the left you'll see a cutout, and there was a rolling stone in there, a circular stone. And it was so arranged that you had to push the stone upwards and chock it with a wooden chock. And then after you had finished whatever you were doing inside the tomb, you just pull out the wooden chock and the rolling stone will roll back into place again. And this is inside the tomb. And this is a standard tomb complex that you'll find all over this region, but also in Jerusalem as well. If you go to the Tomb of the Kings in Jerusalem, is exactly the same as this. And it's not a tomb as we would understand a tomb, perhaps. These alcoves are for taking a body. So you put in a body into these alcoves, and the body would rot away, and then you'd come back in 2 years' time, perhaps, however long it takes for a body to disappear, and all you'd have left is a pile of bones. And then you can collect up those bones, put them into an ossuary, and then you can put your ossuary into a separate location, perhaps in your house, perhaps in the cellar of your house or something. And that's what these round towers were used for. They were used, I suppose, for the soul of the person to depart in this very ethereal place out at Sugmatar, the necropolis of the Odessan kings. But talking of round towers, we have plenty of these. Now this is a little bit larger. This is the Temple of Takur. We saw the conical hill at Sugmatar and the one at Silbury, but this is an even larger, a much larger round tower. This is the Temple of Takur, which is just south of Jerusalem. And it's actually half natural, half man-made. So it's a natural mesa, one of those standing pillars of stone that you get out in Death Valley in America. And someone has built up the sides of it to turn it into a cone, so it looks more pyramidal. And I think that's the whole point of these conical man-made towers. They are substitute pyramids. Again, if you could not build a pyramid, well, perhaps you could put some earth around a mesa and you could turn it into something that looks like the Great Pyramid. And on top of this particular conical hill, there was a temple and a palace built there. It became the fortress of King Herod eventually in the first century BC. But these were very popular all across this region. So if we go further north into Syria, we find this one, which is the Temple of Shmemis, which is just outside Homs and Hama in Syria. And this one is actually an extinct volcano. So they've taken this volcano and again they've put some earth and debris around the side of it to turn it into this conical hill. And again they've put a temple and a fortress on the top of it. And again, this is because they were imitating the form of the pyramids because they knew the pyramids were sacred. And while we're looking at sacred hills, here's another one. Not sure if you recognize this one. This is the Fortress of Masada, which is down on the Dead Sea, just south of Jerusalem again. And this was the fortress that was occupied by the Sicarii rebels after the Jewish revolt. So it was a temple, but it also became a fortress. It was a fortress of King Herod, and it was taken over by the Sicarii rebels during the Jewish revolt. And then the Romans besieged this area. After Jerusalem fell, the Romans besieged Masada for 3 years before the rebels at Masada all committed suicide. It's a very, very famous place within Judaism because this is the final last stand of the rebel Jews against the evil Roman Empire. But do you recognize this from somewhere else? From modern Hollywood films? Well, actually this has been used, this location has been used as the Fortress of Jeddah. So this comes from the Star Wars trilogy. And they've used the same location. They've used Masada as the backdrop to their Star Wars story. And let's look at that again. If you just look at the hill and we'll transform it back again. And this is the actual fortress of Masada. Now you might just say that, okay, this is a flat top hill. They all look the same, you know, it's just a coincidence. There is no link here to be made between Star Wars and the Jewish wars. But that's not true, because if we look at an aerial view, this is an aerial shot of the Fortress of Jeddah from the Star Wars trilogy. Now look at its shape. It's sort of this almond diamond type shape, flat topped in the middle of the desert. You can see the desert hills in the background, and if you look at the desert hills, I'm not sure you can see it here, you can see the lines of the strata of those hills in the background. Now let's have a look at the Fortress of Masada. And you can see it's identical. It's this same diamond-shaped flat top hill in the middle of the desert. And in the background, you can see the strata of all the hills in the background. Undoubtedly, they have used the Fortress of Masada as a centerpiece within the Star Wars trilogy. Why did they do that? Well, because it is the same story. The evil empire, Galactic Empire, was the evil Roman Empire, and the plucky rebels who were attacking the evil empire were the plucky Judean rebels who were attacking the Roman Empire in Judea. It is the same story. And so the Essene monks who used to tour Judea with nothing but a cloak and a sword, not a staff, but a sword, according to Josephus, are the Jedi monks who toured the galaxy with nothing but a cloak and a lightsaber. It is the same story. The story of Star Wars is the epic story of the Jewish revolt, an everlasting story within the Judaic world. And it's been turned into a modern story for the modern world, but preserving the ancient links back to Judea, back to this ancient story. And so you can imagine these rebels in Judea asking, what on earth have the Romans ever done for us? And well, they could mention the aqueducts, the sanitation, the baths, the roads, but I suppose the roads go without saying. You can see how ancient motifs can be used and reused back into the modern era without even many people suspecting or knowing anything about it. So finally, we're going to look at some microliths. We've looked at the megaliths, we've looked at the conical round towers, and now we're going to look at some microliths. And these are based on something you're probably quite familiar with, which is the phoenix. And the phoenix stood upon the primeval mound. And perhaps now you can see where the imagery of this conical tower actually came from. It came from the phoenix, which stood upon the primeval mound, which was a conical mound of earth, the first signs of order within the chaos of Nu. And that was embodied and became, well, it was probably actually a real stone. We'll see it in a minute, but it became the Omphalos of Delphi. When Greece took over Egypt, this stone obviously ended up in Greece, and it became the Omphalos stone of Delphi. And this is not the original, of course. This is a copy made out of marble. And for some reason, it was draped in these chains of, I don't know, they look like seashells or something. But this was the sacred Omphalos of Delphi. It was a sacred stone that was venerated by many people in many regions. And here's that same stone when it went to Seleucia. So this is when Iraq and Iran was all Greek, and the Greeks ran all of Persia, and obviously this stone, or at least the symbology of this stone, was taken into Persia. And this is a Greek coin from Persia, and you see Apollo sitting upon the Omphalos stone. And again, you see the Omphalos stone covered in some sort of netting material you can see on the stone. You can see the Greek there. The inscription is in Greek, and it says Seleukoi, from Seleucia. And here's another Greek coin, again from the same region. of the sacred Omphalos stone. And then the stone came back to, with probably Queen Theomusa Aurania, we've already talked about her in previous lectures. The stone came back to Syria, and this is an image of the stone in Odessa. And now it's being called the Elagabal. And you might say that that doesn't look very much like a conical stone. And you'd be right, because this is a Bethel, and a Bethel is a house of God. The stone being an image of the God, of course, and this is a house of God. And so what we're looking at here is a small box. Perhaps you can see the feet on the bottom of the box. So this is a box that carries the sacred stone. And so we know exactly what this is. This is the Ark of the Covenant. So the Ark of the Covenant was in Odessa. This is the 2nd and the 3rd centuries AD. The Ark of the Covenant was in Odessa, and it housed the sacred Omphalos stone. And then the stone went from Odessa down a little bit further down into Syria. And here it is in Syria. This is the Elagabal of Syria. And now you can see, embossed on the conical small stone, you can see the image of the phoenix. So we now again have the link between the sacred stone and the phoenix once more. And this sacred stone was supposed to be a meteorite. It came in from the heavens in a fiery ball, and that was part of the reason it was sacred, because it was a part of the sun god that had dropped off the sun and come down to earth. It was a sacred meteorite. And here is the Elagabal stone in Rome, drawn by a quadriga chariot. You can see the 4 horses at the front there. And it's a small conical stone embossed with the image of the phoenix, because the phoenix was this fiery bird that came in from the heavens above down to earth. And the Elagabal stone was the same. It was a fiery meteorite that came in from the heavens above down to earth. And in Arthurian legend, this sacred stone was known as the Lapsit the stone from heaven. It is the same thing. But within Arthurian legend, the Lapsit had another name. It was known as the Holy Grail. So here is an image of the Holy Grail. The Holy Grail was not just a cup. It was a multifaceted artifact. It was a cup because that was a good explanation at the bottom of the initiation. It was a princess because that was a better explanation of its sacred role. And it was a sacred stone. It was the Lapsit Elixis. That's why Jesus' primary disciple was called Peter Kephas. He was known as the stone because he was the keeper of the Elagabal stone. But let's have a look at that stone again. Here we have a conical stone in the chariot, and this would have been a meteorite. And a meteorite would look something like this. It's going to be blackened. It's going to be pitted with holes. This is the Willamette meteorite from America. This is what the Elagabal would have looked like, except it would have been slightly more egg-shaped. It was this sort of shape, as you see it in the chariot, an egg-shaped, pitted, darkened, blackened meteorite. And I was just watching a film one day, and suddenly there was an image of the Elagabal stone. And this was really incongruous because it played no part in the film whatsoever. It was just put there. And I don't really know why, apart from the fact that it was just there for the illuminated to be able to see it in a very famous film. So what famous film was this? Well, this was the Elagabal of James Bond. And there we have it. We have a 21st century image of the Elagabal used in a very, very famous film for no apparent reason. So the Elagabal is still being venerated in certain places. And this is a perfect image of what it would have looked like. 007's Holy Grail. So I hope you've enjoyed that illumination lecture, and I hope you can join us again next time. Thank you.